Bring on Gonzaga. This is going to be fun. This is Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Into Locked On Baylor, and thank you for making it your first listen today and every day. Brought to you by FanDuel today. And today, we're talking basketball again. And the Zags coming in from Locked On Zags, Mr. Andy Patton. Andy, how do you do? What a week for you.
I'm doing great, Cameron. I'm excited to get a chance to talk Big 12 hoops yet again. I kind of thought we were done with this conversation, like I said, but excited to get another opportunity to take a look at this.
Not so fast, my friend. All right, we're talking Big 12 hoops today. And let me just get this first from you. Just what was your reaction when this comes back? I know there have been rumors in the past, but yesterday it sounds almost concrete of like, hey, this is going to happen and it's going to happen soon. So I know you've had time to think about it over the rumor time, but what does that feel like to be like, oh my gosh, Gonzaga could be there next year?
Well, the reporters who break stories like this tend to do it at 9 a.m. on the East Coast, which means that it gets broken well before I am awake for the most part. So I have a Locked On Zags Discord channel where we got a couple hundred Zags fans chatting every day. And I woke up, checked it in the morning, and saw like 150 new messages and thought, well, that's a little odd for a random Monday morning. And of course, kind of read through it, saw Seth Davis's article. And I never thought that Gonzaga's quest to join the Big 12 or to join a power conference was dead in the water. I will say that I didn't think that it would be less than 2 months after Brett Yormark says, hey, we're done, we're good, we got the corner schools, we're up to 16, we're going to kind of parse this out and see how we're feeling. I didn't think that it would be this quickly after that, but I'm not surprised that there are continued conversations. I'm not surprised that Gonzaga is trying to push for this to continue to happen for them. And frankly, I'm not surprised. Brett Yormark, that man loves college basketball. He loves college hoops more than any conference commissioner, especially at the Power 5 level, outside of Big East commissioners. But he's a huge fan, and he loves Gonzaga, and I'm not surprised he's still pushing for this.
Yeah, and so obviously this is something that you guys, conference realignment's gotten crazy the last few years, but it feels like as a program that this is the natural next step. And when looking at that, was it always the Big 12 that looked like the fit? I can't imagine it was always the Big 12.
No, I don't think so. And it's interesting because from an institution perspective, the best fit far and away is the Big East. Big East schools are very similar to Gonzaga. They're mostly Jesuit Catholic institutions. They're typically around the same size enrollment-wise. A lot of them are in, somewhat smaller media markets. Not all of them, of course. St. John's, Villanova are kind of exceptions there, but it fits there to a T. Except for geography, where it doesn't fit at all, not even close. And of course,
you don't need that anymore.
Yeah, right. I mean,
don't need that anymore.
Not an issue with Stanford and Cal. But the Pac-12 fit more from a geographic perspective, and was always kind of rumored in there that maybe Gonzaga will join the Pac-12. But the Pac-12, which was part of their demise, was very unwilling to allow any schools that didn't fit their institutional preferences. They wanted big research schools. They were pretty kind of stuck their nose at BYU, who ended up getting the last laugh with their move to the Big 12. And so for Gonzaga, they were kind of in this spot where it was like, well, if the Pac-12 doesn't want them and the Big East doesn't make sense geographically, it kind of never felt like there was another option. Like they had a vote on the Mountain West about 5 years ago. And Gonzaga leveraged that to get a lot more from the WCC. They got a double bye in the WCC tournament. They get a bigger cut of the amount of money that the conference makes for NCAA tournament appearances, which makes sense since Gonzaga gets the vast majority of them. Yeah. And they basically, the WCC didn't want to give them that. They went to the Mountain West. The Mountain West schools unanimously voted to accept them. And then the WCC came around on some of those changes. And that kind of seemed like it was going to be it for a while. But then as the Pac-12 started to unravel, these conversations picked up again. I never thought the Big 12 was going to be a real player. But once Yormark started talking about it, you kind of felt like, hey, this might actually make sense. And his goals of having a coast-to-coast conference, being in every time zone and being a basketball powerhouse, it's like, where else is he going to go? Especially with San Diego State seeming to not necessarily get in that conversation the way that many thought that they would, Gonzaga is the logical choice. There are obvious hurdles, not having a football team, but it makes sense that once the Big 12 kind of got their eyes set on them, that for Gonzaga, they're like, heck yeah. I mean, this is a great opportunity to join not just a Power 5 conference, but like in the short future, potentially a Power 3 conference. So for them, it's a huge move to put themselves to try to put themselves in that kind of position going forward.
And obviously, I mean, you guys hear it every year, and it doesn't slow down the basketball team at all, but you hear it every year of, oh, who have they played? Oh, San Francisco and St. Mary's and Portland and all that. So from a fan's perspective, from Gonzaga fans' perspective, were they ready to get to bigger competition and at least not have to hear this crap anymore? Was it kind of an anxiety from the fans to get out of that? It's
interesting. The fan base is more split than I think you'd imagine they would be. Certainly there's a large segment of the fan base that is incredibly pro Big 12, pro Big East, pro getting into a power conference.
A seat at the table.
Yeah. I think that, and some of those people are kind of also WCC bashers in the way that a lot of the general public is. I'm personally kind of an advocate of the WCC, but won't pretend for one single second that it's on even close to the same level as the Big 12 or the Big East or even the Pac-12. But there's also a segment of the fan base that I think wants to stay in a conference that more aligns with them from that institution perspective. And I think there's also a segment of the fan base and even some of the media you'll see out there who kind of says, why make a move? What is the problem with this? Yeah, there's some people on Twitter yelling about how Gonzaga doesn't play anybody. It's not impacting them. They're getting
one seeds.
Right. They're getting one seeds. They're making NCAA tournament championships. They've been to 8 straight Sweet 16s. No other team has a streak that long. And there's some validity to that argument. And I do think that people who say, well, what is the compelling reason to move outside of money? And even in this, what we've heard from Seth Davis so far is that Gonzaga is not going to get a huge chunk of money up front. They would eventually make more money, obviously, than they make in the WCC, but it's not a huge gain. And so I do understand that argument. I'm not necessarily in that conversation. I think that the Big 12 is the move that Gonzaga should make if they are invited to do so. But I do think that it's not as cut and dry among the fan base as I think people might think it is.
And before we get into our first break here, is there any reason that you've been able to see on why women's basketball was not invited with men's basketball?
Yeah, it
beats me.
I've seen some people a reporter at the Spokesman Review, a good friend of mine, indicated that he thinks it is all the sports. So I think my hope is that it was an error in the reporting at the Action Network, because it just wouldn't make sense to invite.
You said it on Locked On Zags, and I'm looking through, parsing through every report after that, and I'm like, you know what? There are some that say men's basketball specifically. So I'm like, there's no indication that women's, but
it wouldn't make sense to not invite the women's team. I mean, the women's team is competitive. They've won the WCC regularly. They've been in the NCAA tournament. I'm not sure what their streak is at right now, but it's over 5 years. Like, they've been a fantastic program and certainly wouldn't drag down the Big 12 on that side. So I'm hoping that it was an oversight in the reporting and that the women's team would be invited along with the men's team.
Well, they've won the WCC championship. And they could be doing that in the Big 12 in the future. And what you can do to win some money off that is go to FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. We're well into it. This is the best sports season of the year, I think, because we're getting ready for basketball. We've got playoffs in baseball. We've got football in full swing. This is where FanDuel is going to help you the most, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. And I like to lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, though, there's no better time to get in. This is the best sports time of the year. And I say I lose a lot, but I don't anymore because I use FanDuel and they make it really easy for you. Okay. They make it foolproof. If I can use it, anyone can use it. You can bet on spreads, player props, over-unders, anything you can think of. FanDuel.com/lockedon is where you need to go. FanDuel.com/lockedon, America's #1 sports book at FanDuel. So, Andy, looking more at, we're Locked On Baylor, so we're focused on Baylor a little bit. So let's just play it out. In 2 weeks, you guys get the invite. Zags are down for the 24-25 season. you've got some fun new opponents, right? Kansas at the Fog. You've got Kansas State and all that Jerome Tang's got going over there. Hilton at Iowa State. Arizona eventually will be in there as well. A huge basketball powerhouse. Where does Baylor rank in terms of teams that you're looking forward to playing?
Baylor's right, top 3, top 4.
All right, I'll take that. Medal stand.
I think for Gonzaga fans in particular, there's 2 kind of already built-in rivalries that they'll get. And Baylor's kind of the third one in a sense. The top one is Arizona, because Tommy Lloyd spent 20 years as an assistant coach at Gonzaga, was primed to be the next head coach whenever Mark Few leaves, gets an opportunity to leave to be a head coach at a Power 5 school at Arizona, and has had an incredible amount of success in his first couple of years. I know the tournament success hasn't quite caught up to him just yet.
Not yet.
Gonzaga and Arizona have not played each other since Tommy Lloyd left. People are very excited for that first matchup because they used to play each other every year in the non-conference. Mark Few and Sean Miller were heated rivals as kind of a West Coast powerhouse. So not only is there already blood between Gonzaga and Arizona, heck, they went to double overtime in one of Gonzaga's first real NCAA tournament runs back in 2003. There's history for these teams for 20 years. And then you factor in that Few versus Lloyd kind of battle. They're also kind of losing recruits to each other. Ryan Nembhard was a big battle in the transfer portal that Gonzaga won. So I think that's the biggest one. Baylor's probably next in terms of a rivalry that's also a really good team. BYU is, of course, a team that Gonzaga has a lot of history against, but BYU in the last couple of years hasn't been all that great. I think that their basketball is going to struggle fairly significantly in the Big 12. I think eventually, as the recruits start ticking back up, they'll figure it out. But this team finished 5th in the WCC. That's not gonna cut it in the Big 12. So I think the Gonzaga-Arizona battles are going to be epic if this happens, of course. The Gonzaga-Baylor battles, of course, there's a lot of history between these two programs, recent history.
All of a sudden,
and some really good games. It seems like, the worst contest of them was probably the national championship in terms of competition level. But for the most part, tons of really good games there. Of course, Kansas and Houston are just fantastic programs. Not as much history between those two programs specifically, but anytime you get a chance to play against Bill Self and the Jayhawks and the program that Kelvin Sampson's built at Houston, I think there's a lot of really fun history there. Gonzaga has history with West Virginia as well. There's a lot of teams in the Big 12 that I think are going to make this a really, really fun fit for Gonzaga should it happen. But I think Arizona, BYU, Baylor are kind of the top 3 in terms of that history that already exists for the Zags.
And do you see a lot of similarities there between the programs? Obviously, Gonzaga's had success longer than Baylor has in basketball, and are still much smaller. But you talked about the Big East earlier, right? Those small Jesuit Catholic schools. And that's what we're basically like in this conference right now. It's us and TCU being those smaller Christian schools. So do you see a lot of similarities there in terms of, the coaches are good friends. They now both recruit nationally, and they've gotten to the highest point. Do you see that kind of mirroring itself in these programs?
I do. And I think one argument that people will make against Gonzaga is the size of the school. And some of those arguments that I think fall kind of flat when you look at schools like Baylor, when you look at schools like TCU. Gonzaga's enrollment is pretty close to Duke's. Is Gonzaga Duke? No, Duke has a lot more championships than Gonzaga. Even Baylor has more championships than Gonzaga. But the idea that Gonzaga is unable to keep up with the big boys when we've seen schools like TCU come into the conference and have success. We've seen schools that are smaller that have been in those conferences for a long time still have success. It takes one coach to really turn a program around, and not every team can find that guy. Baylor did in Scott Drew. Of course, Gonzaga did in Mark Few. You see, St. Mary's is one of the smallest Division I schools in existence. They're a college. They're not even an accredited university, and they've had massive success in the last 20 years because Randy Bennett is one of the best 15 coaches in college basketball. You can do it. And I know there's fear of what happens when Mark Few leaves? First of all, I think Mark Few is going to die as the head coach of the Gonzaga basketball team.
That's about right at this point.
I'm concerned about that. But I also think this program has structurally built themselves in a spot where they are recruiting at high levels. They have a huge international pipeline. They have consistent success. Their facilities are top notch. There is not a concern for me that this program falls off in the same way that, Baylor maybe has a few bad years if Scott Drew leaves, but they're not gonna just disappear. And I don't think Gonzaga would either. I think they need to get in that spot. And once they get there, once they have that Big 12 tie around them, like I don't see failure kind of as something that, you know, they're not going to win the league every year. Of course, nobody expects them to do that. But I think that they are a program similar to Baylor that has built themselves as a consistent enough program with success on the men's basketball side that they're going to sustain that going forward. And I think that's kind of the closest comparison with those two schools and TCU and others to an extent as well.
So Gonzaga is not DePaul, is what
you're right. Saying. Yes. As much as people have said that on Twitter, if you Google Gonzaga DePaul, you'll see a bunch of tweets about it. And those are insane to me. They're absolutely insane to me. The idea that 15 years ago, people might have said this about Gonzaga, and that might have been a bit more of an argument. 15 years ago, Gonzaga had never been a 1 seed. That happened for the first time in 2013. I know, because I was a student there. It was amazing. But since 2013, or since really 2017, the argument that Gonzaga is not a legitimate power in this sport is just laughable, frankly.
Yeah, and so I think you did lead me into my next question a little bit in terms of, you know, that doomsday scenario. Mark Few leaves, and there's a bad season or two. Does the going to the Big 12 do enough? I guess the main question I have here is, does the Big 12 going to the Big 12 do enough for the entire university? And obviously that's going to raise the athletic profile across the board in terms of sports that matter for money. It's basketball and football, and you only have one of them. And in this case, you don't have either of them. But does that help out the school enough that they're willing to take that risk?
Yeah, I think so. I think Gonzaga has to take this risk. And I
guess it's more onus on the Big 12 side, I guess, come to think of it. But,
yeah, I think so too. I think for Gonzaga, like, there is risk associated with it in the sense that a bad year in the WCC has historically resulted in Gonzaga still winning the league. Like, the last time there was even a remote threat of them not making the NCAA tournament was the 2015-16 season. And they had to win the conference championship to make the tournament. And they did. And they got an 11 seed. And then they still went to the Sweet 16 because they caught fire. And Domantas Sabonis absolutely cooked against Jakob Poeltl in Utah. And they made a deep run that year. But that's a season. If that had happened in the Big 12, not a chance they make the tournament. They probably finished 9th. And like, there is a risk that if something like that were to happen again, that their tournament streak would end. But I would rather be in a position where you're competing in a conference where, yeah, if you finish 5th in the Big 12 and you still get a top 6 seed. So, like, I would rather be in a position where, yeah, you're going to lose more games, but you're going to play better teams. You're going to be more battle tested. And again, I'm not a WCC hater the way a lot of people are, but it's just, I mean, it's apparent that when the bad teams that you play are Cincinnati and Oklahoma State versus Pacific and Pepperdine, like, it's just a significant difference. And so for Gonzaga, they have to make this move. It elevates their baseball program. It elevates their women's soccer program, 2 programs that are routinely ranked in the top 25 or at least close to it. Baseball took a dive last year, but was a back-to-back CC champs before that. Like, that's a really good team. So Gonzaga's athletics are going to be able to compete in the Big 12 across the board. I don't think there's very many sports that, depending on who all they bring over, where they're going to be just like bottom feeders in the conference. And I think that is a smaller portion of the conversation that the Big 12 is having, but it's an argument in favor of them of like, hey, this is a team that has proven it. And once you get that extra money, you get that extra TV deal, and you get, just from a recruiting perspective, every sport is elevated by not having to recruit as a member of the WCC. And I think that you're going to see Gonzaga even more solidify themselves as a perennial power, which feels backwards. People think, oh, they're going to become irrelevant. No, they're not. It's just not going to happen in the Big 12. And I think the fear of Mark Few leaving and the team becoming irrelevant, I think that would be more likely to happen in the WCC and less likely to happen in the Big 12. And I think a lot of people have it backwards.
Yeah, definitely a good point. The big conferences, it certainly lends itself to a certain stability. That's for sure. And when Gonzaga is leaving the West Coast Conference, what they're going to have to do to find a new member, the conference I'm saying, is they're going to have to go to LinkedIn Talent Solutions, another sponsor of today's show, because they make it the easiest, man. Look, that's just what I'm saying, okay? LinkedIn Jobs is the easiest way to hire when you're looking for that. I know that's how I got this job, finding it here on Locked On Baylor, and I absolutely love it. But there's been times where I've had to look for some people, whether it be some interns or some people to fill in a department that I've been working in. And I tell you, LinkedIn is the best way to do that. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to, and they do it faster, okay? They're sifted through. They're not giving you the BS candidates. You post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free, and you start seeing the applicants rolling in. Just like the money will be when you come to the Big 12. The applicants are rolling in, and they make it easy for you. Simple tools. They have screening questions. They make it easy to focus on candidates with the skills that you're looking for, so you can quickly prioritize who you're going to interview and you're going to hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. So once again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. And with that, terms and conditions do apply. And looking at kind of the overarching part here, Andy, I'm surprised, not because they're inviting Gonzaga or going to invite Gonzaga. That seems like a very natural fit. But what we talked about earlier is conference realignment really revolves around football. Mm-hmm. And two things that make me surprised here. And first one I'll ask you is, did you think this move was going to come, or something that wasn't the Big East, after you seeing the conference alignments the last few years and having it all revolve around football? Did you think it was kind of Big East or bust after that?
A little bit, yeah. I think we saw, again, Yormark say how much he loves college basketball. He expressed that interest in Gonzaga and UConn kind of at the same time. Of course, UConn does have a football program, but
yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Good football
Barely,
program.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting that the reporting that we've seen the last couple of days has indicated that Gonzaga and the Big 12 continued conversations kind of not in secret, but quietly the last couple of months while those conversations with UConn ended. And it's possible that those conversations were ended on UConn's side. Like, I don't know a lot of the details there, but I do think that while it was a surprise, there are some things that make sense. Notably, if you're the Big 12 and you're extending an invitation to UConn, UConn's presumably going to look for a cut that more resembles the other football schools in the conference. And if you're like, well, we're only really adding you for basketball and your football is going to finish, outside the top 12 most years, like, why wouldn't we just add Gonzaga, where the main thing we're getting is very clearly a net positive in men's basketball, and they're going to ask for less money. And I think that once I kind of put those pieces together and you kind of see how that might work for the Big 12 and for Gonzaga, it made a little bit more sense. And I think the Stanford, Cal, and SMU move really helped kind of facilitate these conversations going forward for Gonzaga, not just because that was another move that just clearly doesn't care about geography.
In terms of compromising some things.
But it was also a move where SMU and I think all three of them are taking less money up front. And I think Yormark and the Big 12 leadership went to Gonzaga and said, would you be willing to do this?
Yeah.
And Gonzaga presumably didn't want to play all their cards early and wanted to kind of negotiate a little bit more. But the Big 12 knows that the Pac-12 is gone and that a Pac-12 or a Pac-2 Mountain West merger, while they may very well extend an invite to Gonzaga or would, that's not as appealing. So the Big 12 has more leverage. Gonzaga basically had to say, yeah, we're willing to take less money. And then they can go back to the leadership and say, well, look, what about adding this school now when we're not having as much of a financial, it's not going to impact the schools as much financially. And I think once you see that picture come together, it makes a lot more sense why this invite might come and why UConn, who probably doesn't want to leave the Big East again, might not be in that picture as much.
Yeah. And I mean, you talk about the financial part of it. That's the biggest thing. And that's why we see it mostly revolving around football, because football is the most eyeballs. But Brett Yormark has said in the past, basketball's a sleeping giant here. You can still make money off of this. And so I think a lot of people see Gonzaga and they say, of course, great basketball program, but they're not in a market. They're not bringing eyeballs. But the numbers say otherwise, Andy. They say otherwise.
Yeah, they absolutely do.
And this surprised me, by the way. Come to think of it a little bit more, it doesn't surprise me because they are that good and the time slots they go into, but it was surprising to hear this.
Yeah, I wasn't as surprised, certainly, but I do think that there was a general kind of surprise at how much eyeballs the Gonzaga basketball program has had. The service that Gonzaga used to kind of help to the consulting firm that they were using to help try to push for the Big 12 and the Big East and wherever else they were pushing, basically came out with some data that indicated Gonzaga is 5th in a a metric that they called TV Power. This is among men's basketball programs. 5th among all basketball programs. The 4 ahead of them are the bluest blue bloods that possibly exist. Duke, Kentucky, North Carolina, Kansas. That's
You might have heard of them. You might have heard of them.
No Indiana, no Alabama, no Arkansas, no Michigan State. None of those schools. UConn, none of them. The 5 biggest TV power metrics for men's basketball are the 4 blue bloods and Gonzaga. That is where they are at in this conversation. Beyond that, I think some things that really appealed to the Big 12 that I talked about on my show are that Gonzaga's audience skews younger, which isn't a surprise. They have less history. So it makes sense that the majority of people who are diehard Gonzaga fans who are watching every game are probably not a whole lot older than the 40s, mid 40s.
Yeah. Which I think is better for basketball anyway. Exactly. I would say just overall, not that it's not an old man sport, but just overall. Yeah. Yeah.
It's better for men's basketball, I think, in general. And for the Big 12, they want a younger audience. Who doesn't want a younger TV audience right now? It's a desperate thing to try to cling on to because people are watching TV less and they know that. So you get a younger audience. You get an audience in a different geographic location in the Pacific Northwest. That's obviously very valuable to them. And we're talking about a team that when they have played Power 6 opponents, and obviously they have played less games against Power 6 opponents than the rest of the schools in the Big 12, but when they do, their ratings 2.5 times the average Big 12 game, 2.5 times. So
which is the best conference,
right?
Competitively. But I mean, that's unbelievable.
When Gonzaga's on the floor, when they're playing, whether it's a Big 12 opponent, whether it's a Pac-12 opponent, whether it's, Creighton or whoever else they play regularly in the non-conference, those games are blowing up. And I know that there's some concern. How many games does Gonzaga play? They play a lot of games against high caliber opponents. They're
I see it in November and December. That schedule. I don't think there's anyone that year to year schedules tougher.
No,
we've had a really tough non-conference the last 2 years here at Baylor, but it's there. And I think there's a sort of intrigue still with watching Gonzaga because you don't see them in any other sport. Yeah. A lot of people don't know where it is. Trust me, we deal with that a lot too. They don't know where it is, and they're like, well, these guys, especially around the season, last year, Kentucky, these guys can't play Kentucky. They play in Portland and St. Mary's. No way they can beat Kentucky, handle Kentucky. Yeah. Right. So, and that happens every year. And I think there's that intrigue can still carry over. And, we talked about this kind of the whole time, but it's just so interesting that it's a basketball centric move by Brett Yormark. And they're saying, competitively, we already are what the SEC is to football. We are that to basketball. And now we're going to make it a powerhouse the way you think of that with the SEC. We're going to make you think of that with basketball. So my question to you is, to kind of close things out here, we're fans at the end of the day. We know a little bit more than some other people being around teams, but we can't see how this is going to play out. Do you think a basketball super conference can work and keep the Big 12 stable and within a power 3 of what it will probably be in the future?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that some of this is probably in response to the fact that Texas and Oklahoma are proving how good they are at football this season. Yeah. And of course, their departure is probably scaring the Big 12 leadership maybe a little bit more than it was a few months ago. And I think that's a reasonable response to this. But I think you also look at the Big 12's recent additions. You look at Arizona and Houston get all the attention from the basketball perspective. The rest of the schools they added, not great. Colorado, I think, is probably going to be fine. They're a borderline top 25 team coming into the year. Arizona State is okay. Utah's not there yet. Cincinnati and Central Florida aren't really there yet either. So I think for Yormark, they're like, well, we've added a few not so great teams. So let's get more top end talent because this conference can be that. But there are a lot of teams in the Big 12, especially as we get these new schools coming in that are just fine, fine. They did
quantity more than quality.
Yeah, I don't think they diluted their product necessarily, especially because Arizona and Houston are so good. But Gonzaga helps raise that floor.
For sure.
It helps with the ceiling. It helps with the floor. And I think for them, this is going to be a super conference if Gonzaga gets added. It's already a super conference without them. But I think that adding them allows the Big 12 to really focus on that. There's still football's still king. Football's still going to make the most money. Certainly if Baylor or TCU or somebody like that can go on a nice run and put themselves in a position, that's going to be the biggest driver for success for the Big 12 in terms of brand recognition and money and all that stuff. It is. It will always be. But if that's not as likely to happen, especially with the SEC growing the way that they are and the Big Ten growing the way that they are, I think it's very possible for the Big 12 to kind of say, well, this is what we want to focus on. And we're going to have 3 teams in the Final Four. We're going to have 6 teams in the Elite Eight. That would be a tremendous season, but like, it is not outside of the cards that Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Gonzaga, Arizona, like, et cetera, are all competing for legitimate Elite Eight Final Four appearances in the same season. Like, that's not crazy at all to think in the Big 12. And Yormark's basically banking on the fact that more money and more attention is going to come to men's basketball in the near future. If he's right, this is a gamble that's going to pay off tremendously. If he's wrong, adding a school like Gonzaga is not such a, it doesn't contribute so negatively to them financially that it like buries them. So it is a gamble, in my mind, completely worth taking.
And it's going to be weird in 2025. Us Baylor fans are going to look back and be like, in 2021, we beat 2 conference opponents in the Final Four. So that'll be interesting. Andy, before I let you go here, how can people find you? Where can they listen? All that great stuff.
Yeah. So host
they're going to be intrigued.
Host the Locked On Zags podcast. You can find me on Twitter/X at Andy Patton CBB. I'm also the co-host of the Locked On College Basketball podcast with my guy Isaac Shade, who is the host of Locked On Tar Heels. So we're talking all things college basketball on that show 5 days a week. You can find both those shows on YouTube. You can find them wherever you get podcasts as well.
Whenever I see that, I'm so glad you guys weren't doing it in 2017.
Yeah, we would have maybe hated each other.
Yeah, it would have been tough. What would the odds have been, though? That would have been crazy. Anyway, so if you want to drop some 2021 comments on the Locked On Zags, you can. Andy's a great guy, a great sport. He can take it. Andy, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it and love the content. Can't wait to see the Zags in a couple weeks here, starting to make up the Big 12 signs to put on their floor in the summer. Can't wait.
Thanks, Cam. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. This has been and always will be Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears, part of the Locked On